This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
Oh, good day, everyone. How you going? Phil Tarrant. I'm the host of the Smart Property Investment Show. I hope you're well. I must admit that sometimes I struggle understanding what's going on in the world of property investment. It's very tough being a property investor, particularly, and most people are going to go, oh, woe is you, Phil, when you have quite a large property portfolio and properties and assets in different states of Australia, trying to stay on top of what is sometimes the idiocy of state governments. And, there's no love lost between the federal government, state government and local councils. In many ways, it's suffocating and stifling property and the advancement of property in Australia, but I'm going to leave that for another day. That's not what I'm going to be ranting about. What I am concerned about, though, is the spate of changes that are taking place right across this nation, which is determining how you are going to be investing in property moving forward and how your tenants are going to be living in those properties. Well outside my pay grade. So I've pulled the big guns into the studio today. The chair of Property Investors Council of Australia, a good friend of mine and the show, and the co-host of the second best property podcast in Australia, The Property Couch, Ben Kingsley. How you going, mate? You well?
Yeah, I'm terrific, Phil. And, I love listening to your pod and also when Victor gets on and you guys wax lyric about all things property investing.
We do, man. I can't help myself. No, I'm
second best show.
Yeah, it's probably telling people too many of my secrets, but I'm a property investor first and
yes,
probably a journalist second, whereas you're a property professional first, and a very good one, may I add, and probably a commentator second. So we do similar things, but we come at it from different angles. But
yeah,
I need to listen to your stuff sometimes to make sure I'm informed, mate. So that's a little hot tip for people. I'll give a certain view on property and property investment through the lens of being an investor and as someone who speaks to a lot of property investors, whereas Ben's lens is somewhat different. We come from the same point and we want the same objective, and that is we want people making better investment decisions. But I tune into the Property Couch for some of the interpretation analysis, mainly around economic stuff. So thank you for that. But Ben, we joined today as the powerhouse of property podcasting in Australia. Smart Property Investment Show meets the Property Couch, but you come in an official capacity as the chair of the Property Investors Council of Australia. Some people might not be aware of that. So before we get going, I'm going to give you like 30 seconds to tell me what that is.
Yeah, so in 2017, we set up an association that is representative of property investors. So it's not a trade association, it's a non-for-profit association with our objective of advocating and educating property investors. So it's a members-based association. We've got several thousand members. We'd love to have more. And our job is to obviously advocate on behalf of those property investors around the country.
Okay, and I'm happy for you to plug these, or the body, because I think it's very good. What's the website, Ben?
Website is pica.asn.au, so pica.asn.au. It's $5 for a 12-month membership or $20 for 5 years.
$20 for 5 years. Okay.
So we run on the smell of an oily rag. It's all volunteer work that we do. But it's important. If we obviously build up a sizable membership base, then in terms of our advocacy and letting the politicians and the regulators know that we are serious. I mean, at the end of the day, the tenancy associations around the country get tens of millions of dollars of government funding each year to support and advocate on behalf of tenants, which I have no problems with in terms of from a general sense. But when we start to see overreach and we see that the pendulum is swinging too far in terms of what's actually happening, it will be at the detriment in terms of the supply of residential property in this country. And that's critical for obviously economic expansion, growth, human mobility in terms of, that employment, that human capital moving around. So there are some other ramifications as we are seeing clearly in terms of if you don't get the policy settings right for property supply, you don't get the supply. And then ultimately you have the situation that we find ourselves in today.
So there's a lot of repercussions around sometimes misguided policy setting or decision making, and I want that to be the thrust of today's conversation. No doubt, Ben, we will probably get stuck into it as we near the upcoming federal election, which the mail I'm getting, it's going to be this year, probably in December. So
okay.
this is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, okay. early election.
For a whole bunch of reasons. Again, we could probably do a whole podcast on why that would be the case. But there's three things I want to talk to you about today, and I've got to try and give myself some order and structure to this podcast. Number one, I want to talk about New South Wales and no grounds evictions. Number two, I want to talk about some of the changes that are happening in Queensland around tenancy laws, which are very recent. And I also want to talk about what's going on in Victoria, because it feels as though they don't want property investors there.
Yeah, there's no doubt the sentiment has certainly shifted immensely when it comes to the appetite to invest in Victoria at the moment.
Yeah. So there's stuff happening everywhere, which is either changing the potential cash flow position of your real estate assets and or your ability to ensure the longevity or continuity of your investments through a safety net of ensuring that you can have tenants in there and you can actually operate in a fair market economy, which is what that is. And let's point out that we've got a friendly cohort of listeners here who probably all see the world the same way I do. I'm sure there may be some people tuning into this who probably see the world very different to the way we may say it for the purpose of this podcast. I will add, and I will point out for those people who may see the world differently, this is a podcast for property investors, and these are the property investors who are investing in creating wealth for themselves so they can prepare for some sort of retirement or a choice of retirement. And as a result of that, probably not need contributions from the federal government or the state governments in order to do that. So they are contributing. So I'll just make that point. But let's kick off with New South Wales. Ben, no grounds evictions. I've had a couple of people send stuff into my inbox going, Phil, are you aware of this? Do you know what's going on? This is like a 180-degree shift in attitudes towards tenancies in New South Wales investment properties. Mate, what's happening?
Yeah, so let's start with the certain expectation that most property investors have. They want to see their tenants have quiet and safe enjoyment of their properties. You know, let me ask you a question, Phil. Have you ever evicted somebody for no reason out of your property?
Never.
Never.
You'd be mad to do it.
Correct. But our current legislation says that we actually don't need to provide a reason. Now, we all know that, you know, if we've been in relationships as an example, that, you know, if we have a breakup in a relationship, we might say it's not you, it's me, because we don't really necessarily want to get into where that relationship breakdown occurred. And because of no grounds evictions, we don't need to basically start that conversation. So effectively through the property manager, it will just be advised to the tenant that it just the relationship structure hasn't worked, or there's a reason why we need to change the way in which the property is being operated. And so ultimately that's the no grounds. Now, what's happened in your point around this sort of 180-degree view, it's because the regulators are getting feedback from the tenancy associations, and now also in New South Wales where they have a rental commissioner, a tenancy commissioner, and she is constantly getting feedback and working with the different working groups. And I've been fortunate enough to sit down and have a chat with her, and it was a really productive chat. You know, I shared some data which was contradictory to a lot of the data that she had been receiving. And it was interesting when she said at one point that she said that every 18 minutes someone is getting evicted from a property in New South Wales. You know, that did surprise me. It's obviously a shocking number. And so part of understanding what that is because what I just said is if you don't have to give a reason, you normally don't, but there's usually an underlying reason behind why people would decide to evict their tenant. So let me just read through a list of some of those reasons why you might do that, because what we've got is a situation where when she said every 18 minutes, I went, that's interesting. Do you know why? And she said, no, because no one tells us. So they're taking a 180-degree view to now install reasonable grounds, or what they believe are only reasonable grounds, without any data in terms of why you would actually evict someone. So just as a side note, we've created a survey exactly for this point, and hopefully we'll put it in the show description, Phil, where people will be able to fill out. It's a 3-minute survey from PICA. It's in addition to another survey, which we're going to talk about very shortly. But let me just get to this. Here are some of the reasons why we would see reasonable grounds for eviction. Firstly, failure to pay rent or frequency of or late payment of rent, damage to the property or failure to report damage, violating the lease terms, illegal activities going on within the property, health and safety violations, unauthorised occupants or overcrowding of the property, refusal to allow property managers or owners timely access to the property that they own, regular antisocial behaviour or nuisance complaints from neighbours and disturbing the peace, hostile or unreasonable dealings with property managers or owners, owner situations changing whereby they need access to the property for personal or family use. The property is deemed unsafe, requiring rectification works, failure to agree to a new set long-term lease, subletting the property without approval or permission, running a business inside the property without approval or permission, unauthorised alterations to the property outside of what the accepted alterations provisions are, abandonment of the property, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things would be considered consistent and reasonable grounds for which to maybe discuss or debate mentally around whether we're going to evict a tenant or not. Now, what we see in the new legislation here, and this is the information, Phil, that's going to shock a lot of people. So it says here in the survey, which the government has released, and this is what we also need action on from our great communities, is that the bill prohibits landlords from terminating a fixed term or periodic, i.e. month-to-month rolling lease without reasonable grounds. Now, the following grounds are listed in the bill as reasonable for termination of lease. Now, and then it goes on to ask how strongly do you agree or disagree, and that's where we need people to act. But here they are, Phil. I'll read them out to you. The landlord or their family member or dependent intends to occupy the premises for at least 12 months. Not 6 months, not 3 months, whatever, at least a period of 12 months. Number one. Number two, the landlord intends to renovate or repair the premises, and the premises requires or will be uninhabitable for at least 4 weeks. Number three, the premises will be unable to be used as a residence for at least 6 months. I don't know what that means, but unable to be used. And finally, a reasonable grounds determined by the minister. Now, there's not even sale here. And we do know in some jurisdictions around the world, the selling of a property can be withheld as a reasonable grounds. In other words, if you want to go and tidy the property up to get the best result for your sale, I'm sorry, but the way in which this legislation and bill potentially works, it's saying that, no, you can't go in and improve the property. You've got to sell the property with the tenant in the property. So you don't even get reasonable access to the property to show the property off in its best light. So this is the concern we have in terms of the overreach. Now, as I said to you before, I've never evicted anyone for no reason, nor have you, and nor have most reasonable landlords. So the question is, well, what is reasonable grounds? And that's what we're trying to get to. We're trying to get the legislation changed that says, okay, if it's not going to be no grounds, but what about all these other reasons why it's fair and reasonable that there were irreconcilable differences. So
Ben, that shopping list of stuff that you first read out all sounded like reasonable reasons for evicting someone from your property.
That's right, is that
what's in place now? Sorry,
no, they haven't considered that, and because they've not collected the data, they've just assumed that all landlords are terrible, and the power imbalance is the language that we hear them using. So I think it's really important to understand, and this is what I was saying about, irreconcilable differences. There are going to be relationship breakdowns. So I went and did my own bit of research, Phil, on divorces in Australia.
Okay, here we go.
Right? So a divorce happens every 10 and a half minutes, not every 18 minutes like a no grounds eviction, and they are meant to love each other. So let's get context in here. We're talking about absolutely most landlords love their tenants to have quiet and safe enjoyment and just enjoy the experience of renting that property for however long they want to rent it based on the terms of the lease agreement. That is where we want to be. And in the vast majority of cases, in terms of all the research we've tried to do, 90% of cases do have those quiet and safe enjoyment experiences. Now, we know that through the tenancy, the tribunals and all of those types of things, that there's around 3 to 4% of cases that are brought to the tribunals for disputes. And we know of those disputes, we anecdotally believe that half of those disputes have been brought by the landlord for damage of the property or for not paying rent. So what we're talking about here is changing legislation for the minority, for a very small minority, And that is the risk that we have in terms of New South Wales falling down the same trap as what's happened in Victoria. And Phil, if I could just take a quick moment, Western Australian government did a masterstroke. They basically said in their recent review of their tenancy reforms, they kept the no grounds evictions in play. What has that meant? That has meant confidence from the landlord, from the property investor, and tens of billions of dollars are now flowing into that property market to address their chronic needs of rental accommodation.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important that we understand that all of these changes to the rules have absolute confidence and sentiment shifts, and there will be unintended consequences of these types of reforms.
Yeah. Be careful what you wish for is a key point. And just sort of thinking about what you're talking about there, Ben, I just got to make sure that I'm getting the language right. An eviction is something very different, I would assume, from I'm not renewing your lease. But are they putting all that together? So after a fixed term lease, a 12-month lease, if you go, that's it, it's a fixed term, see you later, are they looking to stop that?
No. So after the fixed term, then ultimately, there can be a reason why you would not necessarily renew that lease.
So that you don't need to give an excuse. You just go, I'm not renewing the lease anymore.
Correct.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on, like if you're trying to go to a month to month, you can obviously have discussions around what that looks like and obviously rental reviews and all of those types of things.
But I'm just thinking practically, right? So that's not an eviction. It's just, hey, the term of that contract is over. I'm not renewing it. But then
let me give you an example in Victoria, Phil, where it's even more extreme, right? So if for whatever reason inside the term of the first lease, if you don't notify to the tenant that you're going to not renew their lease within a period, then you can't get rid of them. Like, in other words, the way in which the laws are written down here in Victoria under their no grounds, it effectively means that after that first term is up and you come back and say, that's it, the lease is finishing and I don't want to renew the lease. No, you have to, based on the current laws in Victoria, you then have to keep that tenant in place. So what's the unintended consequences there? The unintended consequences there are, so people are doing, say, 12 or 15-month initial leases, and they're giving notices to their tenants within the 90-day period of that window because they don't necessarily want to be trapped with that same tenant, especially if they feel that the relationship is waning or whatever. So the unintended consequences are, that people are trying to gamify the way in which they can then control their property. So
we need to be, this needs to be sensibility here. And it sounds like they're trying to legislate for the minority rather than the majority. I can think of so many consequences from it, but the base position is that property investors' objective is to create wealth through property and try and hold on to their properties with the minimum amount of costs connected with it. So they've got mortgages and all that other stuff. They need tenants. Property investors need tenants.
Yes, we absolutely, and we love tenants.
And we love tenants. So this is maybe a paradigm mindset shift for some people in government, where property investors are demonized for the provision of property and rental accommodation for a third of all Australians. So I think that mindset needs to change. Property investors love their tenants because they need them in their property in order for them to fulfill their objectives as property investors, right? I don't know any property investor that wants empty properties, right? Like,
that's right. We love law-abiding, safe and quiet enjoyment of the property. Yeah. If they're doing the right thing and we're doing the right thing, everyone, it works.
That's fine. Okay, so that's a base principle. I'd say another base principle is, and I would say this, and I say this all the time, tenants should pay market rent. Whatever the market is, that's open for debate, but tenants should, and let's just assume this, tenants should pay market rent because that's the market rent, right? You shouldn't be gouging tenants. And I would say as property investors, maybe you've got different views or altruistic views towards it all, but just expect market rent. So as long as people are happy to pay market rent, landlords are going to be happy to have people inside their investment properties. That's the real, I'm a really simple guy and I see things really, that's the simple point of view. What it sounds like is happening is that there's certain fringes in and around renters in New South Wales who, for whatever reason, aren't happy with those basic tenants around it. So they're trying to legislate around it to try and make rules for the fringes who sounds as though they don't actually want to live or operate in the rules. And let's remember, we're a market economy, market-driven economy, right? We saw in the budget, Ben, that they're actually giving rental assistance for people to help them afford rental accommodations for a different conversation. So in New South Wales, they're trying to change all of that to, inverted commas, give more power to the tenant. And it sounds to me that all tenants want is continuity. It would be a key thing. They want continuity and predictability of where they live. That's what everyone wants. So I haven't heard any of these debates take place anyway in Parliament. It sounds as though, and I think this is Greens-led initiative, the Greens have worked out that people aren't voting for them for the purpose of climate change and climate action because there's other things at the moment which are more important, and that's called affordability and the cost of living crisis. So the Greens are looking to curry favour with voters by appealing to a segment of society, and that is tenants, and therefore they're beating up legislation like this to make it play. I would tell the state government in New South Wales to be very, very careful what you do if you want to make it harder for property transactions to take place. Because if property transactions don't take place, the key negative influence for the New South Wales government is that they're going to go get a lot less tax receipts when it comes to stamp duty. Hopefully someone smart in the New South Wales government, in the Treasury, the boffins who you don't hear from, they're the bureaucrats, are doing these numbers right now to try and legislate for a small minority to try and fix the perceived problem, which probably isn't a holistic and systemic issue, could potentially cripple the economic fortunes of the New South Wales government.
Bill, let's just talk about, there's one question in question 14 of the survey. So there's a government survey, and it's really important that if you feel strongly about this topic, you must complete this survey. And one of the sub-questions in question 14 is around what do you think is going to happen? So you as a landlord, will you sell up your property? Will you not invest in New South Wales, which is effectively what's happening in Victoria right now. Now it says here, which is one of the really powerful questions, will the bill have an overall positive impact on housing affordability and availability? So let's put that into context. What these naive people are potentially thinking, well, if there's less investors in the market, it means that there's less demand, which means that property prices won't go as high. But the problem with that sort of viewpoint is that when you start thinking about medium and high density constructions, a lot of those developments need to have what we call pre-sales. And they normally need to have around 25 to 30% pre-sales before they can get out of the ground. And they are material numbers of properties to be built. And those developers aren't building them at the moment. They're basically saying that in terms of costs are too great and the demand in confidence from the investor isn't there. And so what's going to ultimately happen when you come and ask this question over, maybe 1, 2, 3 years is if we still have that chronic undersupply, then it ultimately means that rents will go higher. That means that people wanting to save a deposit, which is the number one barrier of getting into property, will take longer in terms of being able to save for that deposit, but there won't be the supply there. So it'll also mean that, even if that 70% of them are still competing against each other for owner occupied, that's not going to have a positive impact in terms of overall price value, because we know that it's supply and demand is what drives value in the short term. And we know over the long term, it's overall economic activity that pushes values and sustains values, in terms of long-term capital growth.
So they're going to stifle the attitude and aptitude towards development because of this, number one. Number two, this perceived idea that this will reduce rents. The question I have, Ben, I'll ask you this question. Why do a third of Australians rent versus 2/3 who own their home outright or have a mortgage against it? This is the question. Why do a third of Australians, why do a third of people in New South Wales rent?
Yeah, so there's lots of reasons why people rent. Now, there is those people who what we refer to as no choice, right? So their financial situation, their household situation, their dynamics in their house hasn't allowed them to be able to secure permanent accommodation or own a property. Relationship breakdowns, domestic violence. So there is absolutely a vulnerable members of our community, and they do need to have social and public housing. And there is an argument to make sure that we have an adequate supply of that. Let's hope that our society can get through these silly moments and, of what's going on and help people with mental health issues and try and help people in terms of getting ahead in life. So that's a story for another day.
Yep.
But then there's also a lot of people by choice. And by that, I mean that people are choosing to, leave their home and go and share with flatmates and go and live by the beach or have different experiences, build new networks and relationships and friendships and those types of things. There's also people who are in between homes who have sold a home and are currently looking but haven't found that right home. They need rental accommodation. There's also people renovating their property, so they have to move out and they need accommodation as well. There's people who choose to live in an area purely for the lifestyle element, but because they can't necessarily afford to buy there, they're also being that. There's people who choose to live in school zones and rent to be in those types of school zones. There's new migrants coming into the country that are also looking to establish themselves, but not ready to buy yet. They don't know exactly where they want to, sort of put their roots in the ground. And then there's also transient workers that need to come in and perform short-term project work or seasonal work as part of that. So you can now see, Phil, you can get the gamut of all the different types of renters. So that's why I say from an economic point of view, it's absolutely essential that we have human capital mobility. If you do not have that, then in reality, your city struggles or your town struggles to grow, because not everyone who arrives on the doorstep buys a property outright. And there's a reason for that. We have stamp duty, which is exorbitant in terms of how much we charge, to actually get in and out of properties in this country.
Well observed, Ben. For me, I simplify most things, and most people rent. I think most people that live in Australia or in New South Wales would like to own a home, right? That's cool.
Yep.
That's a great Aussie dream, right? Most people rent because they can't save enough money in order to get a deposit, to get a loan, and or they don't generate the income in a way in which it satisfies the bank that they're happy to lend the money. Really, really simple stuff. And I heard some statistic now, Ben, and I'll probably butcher this, but like 50% of all workers now have non-traditional employment, which means that they don't work like a 9-to-5 job.
The gig economy type worker.
The gig economy, they've got five different jobs. They like flexibility and all that, which is really, really cool. But that means it's harder to borrow money, right? So the point is that we need rental accommodation in Australia. We're talking about New South Wales. We need rental accommodation in New South Wales for all the reasons you spoke about, to house all these people. Rental accommodation in many ways is a keystone to economic growth in New South Wales, Australia, wherever it is. It's absolutely critical. The governments, state governments, irrespective of that, have proven that they're not good property managers, and the federal government incentivizes Australians to invest in property to provide this asset class, because the state government can't do it, won't do it. Federal government can't do it, won't do it. Local governments can't do it, won't do it. They can't even get affordable and social housing right. They're struggling just on that thing. So this is structurally how it's set up in Australia. So what you're getting with these no grounds evictions is 2% of this is wrong for a certain amount of people, so we need to change everything. They're throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yep. It's regulating to the lowest common denominator. That's exactly.
What do we do about it, other than me and you sort of talking about it, me moaning about it?
That's why PICA was formed. We need to be that voice for the community, and the action points are really clear. We need you. There are 2 surveys listed in Phil's show notes. So click on the link for the state government, the New South Wales state government survey. Complete that survey as you see fit. Let the government know your concerns around that. PICA there's no ability for a public submission, only the public survey. But the New South Wales government has allowed for associations like PICA and also PIPA to put their feedback in through those applications. But Phil, let's be honest here. We've got a government federally where they've got a working group, a housing working group. And one of the mandates in that working group is they believe that no ground evictions should be introduced right across the country. And which means it limits then the choice of the investor, and they'll just have to put up with it. But you saw there that Western Australia were willing to go against the grain on that. They had 20,000 less bond registrations, and they could see the problem going on, that basically investors weren't attracted to that state. So I give credit to the West Australian Labor government who decided, no, we're going to do what's best for Western Australia. And yet, you've got this Victorian government with their head in the sand saying, we're going to do what's best for renters, but ultimately killing off tens of billions of dollars of investment coming into the state. And it just means the irony here is the people that they're trying to protect the most, Phil, which is the tenant, are going to pay higher rents.
And it's going to be harder to find rental accommodation because there's going to be less of it.
It'll be chronic.
In a growing population where we can't keep up with the new builds for today's population, let alone the population of tomorrow. So everything is counter-cyclical to it on the basis of this impression that it's going to be easy for people to find rental accommodation. It's going to be cheaper. The opposite is going to happen. I think we've done it well. I like it, Ben. I'm happy that we're having a chat about this. We're going to do a story on it, smartpropertyinvestment.com.au, and we'll put all those surveys in notes as well. The issue you're going to have here is, I think, who really cares about this, right? I think the people who care the most are going to be the people who are renters who have been told or persuaded by whoever is behind this.
Correct.
That this is important.
Yep. Well-funded associations.
Associations. And let's remember also, a lot of these tenancy bodies are government funded as well, right? Mm-hmm. Be careful what you wish for, New South Wales, and hopefully common sense will prevail. And I hope if someone there who is sensible enough to be educating themselves on the voice of the investor, the what is it? 8% of all Australians own investment property. These are in many ways the backbone providing rental accommodation for Australia. The unsung heroes in many ways. That the Greens will tell you otherwise, Ben. They will paint property investors as evil rich people who are picking off the carcass of poor tenants. Now that's a bit sensationalist, but that's how they frame it. That's not the reality. Most tenants do good. Most investors do good. Let market economies dictate the way it should be focused, and that should satisfy 95% of people who operate in and around investment properties. Don't legislate for the 5%. Don't be mad. Don't be stupid. We've seen the Queensland government have a crack at this, trying to change the way in which they wanted to tax property investors, and you saw what happened there, and no doubt the same thing's going to happen here. Want to talk about Queensland?
Yes.
Go and fill out the surveys. We'll be back in one moment. I want to get stuck in really quickly in Queensland. Back in a moment. Welcome back. Phil Tarrant, host of the Smart Property Investment Show, having a chat with Ben Kingsley from the Property Investors Council of Australia. Sign up today, $20 for 5 years. That's the best money you'll probably ever send, because these guys are out there advocating the voice of Australia's property investors. And I don't want to go over how important property investors are. I think I've made my point. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't feel bad about trying to manufacture your own wealth creation through investing in property. Now, we've seen in Queensland, Ben, more tenancy legislation coming out. They're changing it again. I would like to know, anyone, here's a challenge for any of the state governments out there. Number one, come and have a chat to me on this podcast. You roll out anyone you want, from your premiers to your treasury people, whatever. I don't really care who you got. Come and have a chat. Come and have a chat to Australian property investors, because I'm telling you, between myself and Ben, you're probably talking to every single property investor in Australia via our various networks of influence across podcasting, et cetera. So you want to come and have a chat? Come and have a chat. But the challenge to the state governments, how many of the people who are creating legislation around tenancy rules and how property investment works are actual property investors? I'd love to know that stat. Is it the expectation? Is it the norm of the propensity of Australians to invest in property? I reckon no one invests in property. But anyway, that's just me being a journo, and I can say that stuff. Ben needs to be a lot more sensible and considered, because he's a very important chairman of an association. He will smile and smirk. He will let me say it. But what's going on in Queensland, Ben?
Yeah, so there's obviously the new reforms have been introduced. So there's a couple of things to talk about there about trying to get the balance right. So we've got a lot of new minimum standards that have come through, and again, that's about increasing, in some cases, the safety, but in other cases, the quality of the experience of the tenant. So you can sort of argue line ball in terms of some of those things. But the other interesting one is they introduced the annual increase. So there's only, every 12 months, you can only do one increase in terms of the rent that you charge on the property. So it doesn't actually stay with the tenant that you've got in there. So let's use an example where that tenant has been in the property. Let's say they're on a month-to-month lease and they give notification, or you give notification, and they decide to leave. You can't put your rent up if you put the rent up 8 months ago. So what you need to do in terms of, as a property owner, as running you're a small business, private rental accommodation provider. That's effectively what you are when you run a property investment business. You're running these private rental accommodations. So what you need to do is you need to talk with your property manager, and you need to advertise the rent of that property at a higher level, but also just be mindful that in the terms of the contract, you've got to say for the first, in that particular case, the first 4 months of that agreement, that you'll be charged at the lower rent. So you want to be transparent, about what your intentions are in terms of trying to attract that new tenant. So if you are going to lift the rent higher, you just need to let them know that. And so that's how you're advertising for that. Because we were worried that it's like, well, what do? Do you just start with month to month and then roll into an annual lease once that 12-month period rolls over? No, the answer is you can still negotiate the terms of the lease that says, okay, I've got to keep that there for the remainder of that 12-month period. But then after that, I'm going to ratchet that up to whatever level it needs to be market rent. And then ultimately that will then roll through. And that'll just keep rolling through for as long as you've got that tenant. But again, if that tenant moves out, the same principles apply. There can only be, it's property-based, it's not tenancy-based. There can only be one annual increase every 12 months.
So when things start getting complicated is when you know something's not right. And I've always said property should be really, really simple. If you're a property investor, let me give you a red hot tip. Property investment is largely idiot-proof, right? If you get it right. Buy a good asset in a good area and hold on to it for as long as possible, and try and make it as cheap as possible to do so. That's all property investment is, right? When you hear otherwise around property investment and someone's got a grand scheme about how to make property investment faster or different, or there's a hack that no one else knows about, that's when you got a question mark and go, well, what's going on here? I don't understand it, right? What's happening in all the different jurisdictions is that they're making it onerous for property investors to be property investors. It just sounds like a knee-jerk response to it. Now, what you see playing out, Ben, is that if I'm in a rent review, right, and I know that I can't increase my rent for 12 months, I sit there and I think, well, what actually, this is a genuine question, and I ask it all the time, what is the market rent? Is the market rent the rent today, or is the market rent the rent after 12 months? And if you ask a property manager that question, most of them will balk it and they won't be able to give you a response of it. And the question I put to you, if you're renegotiating market rent, Ben, and what would be your advice or recommendation to your clients in your business?
Yeah, so we run an analysis, Phil, where we do a radius of 500 metres around the property for like comparable properties. And if we can't find enough of those like comparable properties, we'll extend that radius out using our algorithm to a kilometre. And that'll give us indicative asking rents at the moment. So we're obviously scanning the market for all of that data in a real time. And then we'll present that as a plausible percentage change that has occurred. And then we can potentially add that percentage change as part of the analysis that we do. And then we give a table sort of showing what's actually happening more broadly in the market for units or houses based on the attributes of the home. So bedrooms, bathrooms, car spots. So we're very technical in terms of how we do that analysis, as I'm sure a good property manager will be using, tools like CoreLogic's rental appraisal tools and the like to get an indicative assessment of where the market rent is at that point. But to what I think what you're alluding to there is also having a look at which way is the vacancy rate trending? Is it trending in a downward direction or is it trending in an upward direction? So is there going to be more pressure on price now that you know that you can only move it, once every 12 months? And again, I have no problem with once every 12 months. I think we can look at that and say, okay, well, let's plan ahead. Let's be strategic about that. And again, we've got to meet the market. One of the things that's really important to know, that's still a supply and demand story here. So even if we want to increase the rent, if there was ample supply, we've got to meet the market. And so we've just got to take the rent of the day. I think what's happening, to your point, why are we in this situation? Really simple. It's because we have a very ordinary regulatory system that runs our property market and approvals and build constructions. And we had, yes, no doubt we had a supply crunch, and that led to an inflation bubble coming in. Now it's demand driven. It's not necessarily, in terms of supply issues that we originally had 2 years ago post-pandemic. But what we've found ourselves is now governments are getting ear-bashed around how can you fix my problem, and how they believe that they need to act is they need to effectively, manipulate the market. And that's the unintended consequences that we see. Those types of decisions have massive consequences in terms of confidence in a market. We do not, as people who operate in an open and free market, the last thing you want is government intervention. And you don't know what they're going to do next, whether it's going to be rental freezes or rental caps. And so with that type of lack of confidence based on the political persuasions, you turn away tens of billions of dollars of investment from investors ready to roll who know that there's an opportunity there to invest those dollars. And again, they go to the states that are more favourable in terms of looking after or accommodating the small business property, private rental accommodation providers.
Yeah, mate, investors and developers, right? It's just stifling what is a key issue, and that is we need to make more housing available.
Yep.
Again, it's for a different time, but you just think of the inefficiencies here, and the federal government is just loading up at the moment. They're a war against private business largely. They're getting rid of consultants, more public servants, etc. Now, why do we make it so hard for us? Why can't we? They've been asked that question for 100 years. Why can't we just have universal legislation, which is the same in every single state when it comes to this thing? It's going to make everyone's life so much easier. But you have these fiefdoms who, you think about the inefficiencies in the lobbying, you think about the inefficiencies in the different associations, you think of the inefficiencies in the bean counters doing the maths around this, right? It is absolute madness. Just get a universal nationwide legislation around this. I'd champion that like you wouldn't believe, and have a sensible, informed debate around it at a universal level and put the rules in place.
Yeah, look, lands, titles, legislation is, to your point, state or territory based. We're such a small country from a population size point of view. It would make a lot of sense that we would try and coordinate that. But I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime, Phil. And I hope that I live, a long life.
Enough to see your property portfolio double another couple of times, Ben, no doubt.
I'll talk about the other couple of things that are also interesting. Here's an example. I was speaking to one of the great property management businesses up in Queensland earlier today, and they had a family that's relocating from New Zealand, right, to Brisbane. And they hadn't found their employment. They see the opportunity over here, and they wanted to pay 12 months rent in advance, right? Now, because effectively under the new legislation, the property manager needs to make adequate inquiries about the ability to actually afford the rent, right? Now, and how they judge that is you need to have a job. Now, previously, you could actually pay rent in advance for 12 months, which would give confidence to the landlord and potentially that, at least the 12 months rent's paid, and then ultimately they can have quiet and safe enjoyment of that property. Well, guess what? These new arrivals into the country can't be considered for any rental applications at the moment until they get a job. So what do they have to do? They have to go and live in Airbnb or hotels or whatever it may be, and which is at a premium. So they're forced to pay a premium. Welcome to Australia. Welcome to the great southern land. And here we are doing these types of things. And the last one, the rental bonds, they're now capped at 4 weeks. So if you've got a really nice executive property, usually if there's damage or repairs that need to be done, they're not cheap in terms of if you've got the top of the line cooling and heating systems or smart systems throughout the home. But the maximum you're only allowed to keep in the bonds, in your rental bonds, is 4 weeks, and that's retrospective. So all of that money that was retained for those executive properties, based again on the minority of people that we're trying to fix the problem for, it has a ripple effect right through the entire ecosystem of private rental accommodation. And so now they're getting refunds back to that point. And so I asked Steph a simple question. I said, all right, now what does it mean then if I've got, coming back to the 8 months where I still can't raise the rent because of the 12-month moratorium on increasing rents? I'm like, what do you do then? She goes, well, we can only take the lower value and then we ask for a further bond increase after that 12-month period. This is the sort of red tape bureaucracy crap that goes on, all because of feedback coming from one side of the equation, which is the tenancy associations. Now, I just want to make a point here, Phil. If I was on the call centre and I was hearing all of those difficult stories from people who are doing it tough, I would also have a bleeding heart for their situation. I would. And I would be advocating, thinking that I'm doing the right thing. So make no mistake, the people who operate in these tenancy associations, they honestly believe they are doing the right thing. That's my true belief. I think it's the unintended consequences, and it's not knowing how market forces work and not knowing the ramifications and the unintended consequences of their decisions. That's really, they're just thinking, I'll just fix this problem. I'll just put a Band-Aid on this problem, but cause other leakages and other damage that's going on behind the scenes.
You make a really good point. You said it beforehand. I completely concur with it. And I'm first, and whether I'm talking about budgets or the responsibilities of the Australian government or federal, state, local governments, we need to look after those people who can't look after themselves.
Correct.
Right? Absolutely. And we have a civic duty to doing that. And I'm happy for my taxpayers' money to go there. Okay. I think that's good. What we're not very good at is dissecting people who are in need and who actually generally need support versus the realities of living in a prosperous and vibrant nation, which is growing and advancing, albeit GDP is only 0.1%. But we've got to be able to dissect those two things. There is a massive obligation on behalf of governments to look after those people who, for whatever reason, can't look after themselves.
Most vulnerable, for
Most
sure.
vulnerable. And I would imagine many of the calls going into some of these groups you're talking about are probably connected in with that. That's a government issue that society needs to be conscious of it and aware of it and be supportive of it. The government needs to sort that stuff out. Everything else is like the economy. We don't live in a socialist state. We don't live in a authoritarian state. We live in a vibrant democracy. Some people might argue against that, but we live in a vibrant democracy. The market is the market is the market. Yep. What people want versus what they may or can have at any point in time are two very, very different things. You know, you only look at the housing affordability debate, Ben, where they say, well, you know, back in the day, we should be able to buy homes at 4 to 5 times the average salary, right? Rather than whatever is 13, right? Let me give you a hot tip to everyone listening. You can buy pretty much anywhere in Australia a place to live for 4 to 5 times the average salary, even in Sydney. There's units in Canterbury that you can buy for $450,000. You can still buy 1-bedroom studios or studios in and around, you know, the greater city basin for a number that starts with 3. You know, all this is available. It might not be where you want to live, but it's probably where you probably can live at the moment with a view towards the future. Like, there's a lot of big issues here, right? The social stuff we've got to look after, but everything else, we've just got to get on with it, be sensible. We can't legislate for the minority. We've got to legislate for the masses so the masses get the best maximum involvement and upside from it. We need to make more housing. We need to incentivize developers. We need to ensure property investors, there's enough skin in the game for them to make it a worthwhile asset class for them to invest in. Because if you don't have property investors, governments, you got massive problems. You got bigger problems that you could ever imagine if they're not in there providing this asset class for Australians to live in. Now, it might not be perfect, and some property investors might not be doing the right things. Like, of course, same sits on the other side of the ledger. Not all tenants are nice people either. Yeah, there are professional tenants who know the game and know the system better than anyone else, you know, and they often manipulate the system. Now, that's a very, very small fringe of that cohort. But be very careful, state governments, and you want to make sure property investors see merit to be investing in your backyard because they're going to be driving economic activity, which is going to help support the growth of the nation, but also the states that you operate within. Victoria, very quickly, Ben.
Yes.
I think they're probably doing the exact opposite of that. Let's go to a break. Stay with us, back in a moment. Welcome back, Phil Tarrant. I heard a chat with Ben Kingsley from PICA. Now, you live in Victoria.
I do.
I see the former Premier just got a King's birthday honour, which is pretty polarising. Let's not go there. However, it seems to be as an armchair economic observer, as a state in distress. Well, I can't remember what the flag of Victoria looks like. I know what the other states are, but I imagine it's probably hanging upside down, flying from a flagpole on top of some landmark down at Parliament House, whatever. It is in distress, and its response to it is to go, hang on a second, we've got to raise money quickly. Let's have a crack at property investors.
I think you've nailed it, Phil. We are moving towards debts in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So I think it's going to peak out at about sort of 160 odd billion dollars. I have to double check those numbers. But the number that does stick with me, by the end of the 2025-26 financial year, we will be paying interest of $26 million a day for our debt. So we've got, you know, significant economic problems that are going to manifest themselves down here in Victoria. And to your point, the political way to win this is to go after those who have versus hitting the ones who have not. And we've been here before, for those of you who are as old as me, when we had this other debt disaster off the back of Joan Kirner and John Keynes' era of government. We had to introduce a debt levy to every household in the country. So, you know, we were doing the numbers the other day. that would equate to about $50,000 of debt for every household in the country. So even if you say let every household pay $100 or $200 as a debt levy every 12 months, we've got some big problems here, right? So that's going to manifest itself into also some challenges more broadly to the economic activity in the market. Now, I know, Phil, as much as everyone else does, when I look medium to longer term, this is not my first rodeo. I saw some of the, Bob Carr era damage that was caused and introducing vendor taxes and stamp duties and all of these other wonderful things that ruined a good property market in Sydney. All of those things eventually get unwound and they get overcome. And that's really what we're seeing here. So just a quick highlight. So the rental bonds data that we collect here in Victoria was reported last week. And it says that in the last 12 months, Victoria has lost over 15,000 rental properties. And in the last quarter alone, based from December to March, so that's the latest data we've got, over 10,000 less rental properties in Victoria. So we are definitely going to see a situation whereby rents are going to continue to go because we've now got a land tax which kicks in at a $50,000 land threshold, which is adding another 615,000 taxpayers paying land tax in Victoria.
Backdated, right? Didn't it? Was it?
No, 1st of January.
1st of January coming, okay.
2024.
Yeah.
So, but what it means is you've got 133 reforms in the Tenancy Act, which has increased the compliance costs and the holding costs of the property. You've then got obviously a windfall tax, which makes it more expensive for developers to build, which ultimately means that the land prices become more expensive. That ultimately gets passed on to the buyer. And now we've got this land tax. And Phil, the reason why I wanted to bring this up is they're also now seeking further feedback from the general public in regards to increasing their minimum standards. So now what they want to do, it couldn't be worse timing, but they want us to now have insulation in the roofs and they want us to put all of these sort of door stops that will stop, drift of air. And so it's beyond now safe enjoyment of the property, comfortable enjoyment. So they're moving towards their 2045 net zero target and they're making landlords of Victorian properties do it. They're not asking the property owners who own 70% of the property stock down here to do it, but they're asking landlords to do it. And so it just reeks of desperate activity that's going on. So they have to kick the can down the road on this one. But we need, again, if you own a property in Victoria, you need to fill out, we'll put that in the show notes, a link for that one. You've got to fill out that survey because it really is inappropriate because all these additional costs, because rental vacancies are going to be so tight, the owner is going to be able to pass on those costs. So make no mistake, whoever's listening to this, who's part of a tenancy association or who's pro-tenant, the fact of the matter is over the last 12 to 18 months, due to 13 interest rate rises, due to higher compliance costs, due to, these land tax provisions, it's become incredibly expensive to run your small business rental accommodation in Victoria. And so in most cases, most of us have only recovered about 25% of those fixed costs. Now, if we were a fish and chip shop or we were running some other type of small business, we would be out of business. You couldn't just only pass 25% of those costs on. So effectively, at the moment, a lot of property investors in Victoria are subsidising their tenants, but it's going to get to a stage where they just can't keep subsidising them. So ultimately, they are passing on those rental increases to the tenant. So we've said it to the Labor government down here in Victoria that you have introduced a tenancy tax. That's exactly what you've done. So the people you are trying to protect the most, you are hurting the most. And so you need to get the balance right. And that's why we're willing to talk about, we've got some great ideas in terms of what you should be doing at a national level and at a state level. Because one of the other thing, Phil, that is also important to remember, in the 2021 financial year, the ATO reported net proceeds, positive proceeds of capital gains tax of around $37 billion. Now, those capital gains tax comes from gains in value from when you buy an asset and when you sell an asset. So if you want to adjust for affordability, then you need to also adjust for significant less revenue coming in. This is outside of stamp duty and outside of any of the land tax provisions that are being paid. So again, be careful what you wished for.
Sorry, hang on. Let me understand that. So you're talking about the tax receipts from capital gains tax and you don't pay capital gains tax on your principal place of residence, correct?
Correct. Yep.
So we're talking about people selling houses for more than what they bought it from for the purpose largely of property investment, or it's in some sort of structure, which means it's not capital gains tax exempt.
Yep.
So property investors, let's call them property investors, contributed how much money?
So what we're looking at here is it's around $37 billion. Now, remember, we've got, the Greens spokesperson for the federal Greens, which is Max Chandler-Mather, talking about the $2 or $3 billion that we give in terms of allowing for the interest charge to be deductible in running our small business.
Negative
gearing.
gearing.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering, Phil, in terms of the overall gains. Now, those gains can also occur when it comes to potentially some commercial property. We've asked the ATO to see whether they can break those gains down. But this is my point. If you run a fabulous economy and you keep growing the economic pie in terms of gross production, and that creates this wealth base, that wealth base then pays taxes on that wealth base, and that ultimately funds the schools, the hospitals, all of those critical elements. So if you were to then say, all right, we're going to cut negative gearing, or we're going to really, death by 1,000 cuts for property investors, well, then where are you going to find those tens of billions of dollars of capital gains receipts that you're currently enjoying right now? So it really
hang on. I'm going to look at this ledger. Property investors, there's $2 billion negative for the federal government, which they essentially give back.
Here we go. It was 3.2. So in the 2021 year, because interest rates were low, Phil, check this out. We were actually a net contributor to government revenues of $3.2 billion, right? Now, the prior year to that was we took 0.2, so 200 million out, but the year before that it was 3 billion when interest rates were high. Now interest rates are going back to where they are, so it's probably going to be around $3 billion that, Treasury would argue that it's foregone tax receipts. But here's the numbers. Individuals in terms of real estate for the 2021 tax year, $27.3 billion in capital gains tax revenue. Companies, $7.3 billion. Super funds, $2.5 billion in real estate. So I get sick and tired of hearing these arguments about property investors not paying our way when we are clearly paying our way. And to your point before, when we talk about when we get to a retirement age, we are still paying tax. We want our properties to be positively cash flow. So that's actually income that we're going to have to pay tax on. So it does, again, it's sort of this whole idea of throwing the baby without the bathwater. It's cutting off your nose to spite your face. It's all of those sort of sayings that we talk about. And it's because these people have no clue about the economic engine and the flywheel that runs the economy, and then how that impacts living standards. And if those people sell that property, they put money into super, and then they go and spend it in the restaurants and the bars and on, retail, all of that money gets recycled back into the economy.
$27 billion in capital gains receipts received by the federal government for a cost of $3 billion depending in sort of negative gearing benefits.
Yep.
That's simple.
So 24 billion net. This particular year it was actually 30.5 billion because it was positive. But as I said, interest rates have gone up, so a lot of us are getting.
So property investors contribute $25 billion to federal tax receipts, not counting what happens. Mum and dads.
Yep.
Yeah,
we just don't know whether it's residential property and commercial. We think the bulk of it is obviously residential. It would be logical that it is.
Irrespective, Ben, it's a big bloody number.
It is.
And property investors are demonised, and property investors are chased all over the place to continually gouge them even further. There's going to be a point where it doesn't make sense anymore.
Once you hit that threshold, Phil, of a risk-adjusted return where the risk doesn't justify the effort and the investment, we're in for a hell of a shock.
Maybe this is the new property clock. How far through how close are we to that? Let's. I think we need to.
Yes.
we need to come up with a concept or a term around this. Let's call it
no return.
This precipice, right? This precipice where it all becomes too hard. And I think we've been clearly stated that if you mess with property investment, it can cost the government tens of billions of dollars. Even if you tinker with a little bit, you're talking billions of dollars in loss.
Billions.
Actually, at a federal level, not counting what's happening at a land tax and or a stamp duty level, right? So how far from this precipice where everyone's going to just go, stuff it, it's too hard, I'm going to put my money on and buy CBA shares?
Well, here's an example for Victoria. 53% of total revenues come from property tax-related charges. It's unsustainable, Phil, and that's why it's just one of those critical things that we need to get the balance right. Yeah. And today's show is really about that. It's just basically saying we're happy to pay our way to a point, but it's just getting ridiculous. And if you keep doing that, the unintended consequences are you will not have rental accommodation, adequate rental supply to be able to house a growing population. And a growing population is actually good for this country. Yep. It's not bad. It grows the economic pie, and it's that economic pie that spins off the taxes to pay for our beautiful Medicare system. We're very blessed in this country. We live in the greatest country in the world, and we are potentially bordering on risking ruining it because of the way in which we're making decisions in terms of how much support we are giving to the most vulnerable versus how much it is about telling people, we want you to be aspiring Australians. Work hard, play hard, get yourself a foundation in terms of a property behind you, and then go off, and do your thing. So it can be frustrating, and that's why we're going to put a stronger voice in behind it as the election, if it is going to be in December. We're going to be interested to see exactly what sort of policies they put in place. But the 2.3 million property investors out there, we all vote, and we've got to remember that we all vote. And so if we can galvanise ourselves, hopefully through the PICA Association, getting tens of thousands of members of that association, all of a sudden now we can then have that political influence that we're looking to have. Because right now, most investors probably won't even be aware of it. They weren't aware of the 133 reforms in Victoria. And then when they found out, they cracked it, and they're selling their properties like hotcakes. So that just gives you some idea in terms of keeping people informed, and it's through great podcasts like yours, Phil, that we're able to do that.
Well, thanks for coming on. I sort of duck in and out of property. It's not a full-time gig for me, but when I do, I sometimes sit and I just go, God, it shouldn't be this hard. But, I feel good about being a property investor after understanding and appreciating our contribution to Australia through all these different things we've spoken about. And I absolutely love tenants. I think tenants are brilliant. Tenants are brilliant. They're an absolute essential part of property investment.
Essential.
And we want our tenants happy. We want them happy. We want them engaged. We want them to pay their rent as well, right? Let's be clear.
If you're not looking after your tenant, then it's on you. It's not on the tenant. Look after your tenant. Make sure they have safe and quiet enjoyment of the property, and have a harmonious, relationship with them. And we hope that everyone eventually owns their own property in Australia, or owns the dwelling on side of land. I do see a trend here, Phil, where we will see more of these sort of larger corporates buying and building estates, and you will own the dwelling on top of the land, but ultimately the land will still be retained and you'll be paying rent on the land, but it will still mean that you can afford to have a house and to obviously create magical memories in that.
I think there's lots of innovation. There's still a lot of innovation around that. I think, and maybe a time for another podcast, I think Australia needs to accept that the way that property has been done traditionally for the last 100 years, with quarter-acre blocks in the suburbs, versus how it's going to look into the future, probably going to be two very different things. And that's okay. Agreed. That's okay. But we'll talk about that. Ben, thanks for informing me in particular, but also our audience, voice of reason and sensibility, offsetting my probably more emotional sort of responses to some of these changes.
I was emotional.
It's really good. But I highly encourage you to listen to Ben's podcast, Property Couch, with Bryce Holdaway. Those guys do really good work. Really informed economic correspondence and commentary. Get some good guests as well. Go and find them. And PICA, pica.asn.au. Go and spend $20.
Come and join us. Yeah,
I'm sure it's a tax deduction, is it? $20?
Good question
for an accountant.
Question for the accountant. But please fill those surveys in. So where you find the story in SPI, or you find it, and you're listening to the book, go to the show description where those links are. And because we only have literally 2 weeks, or maybe it's even less. So, jump on there. It does need your urgent attention.
And if you're really worried about it, speak to your local member. Just Google, you get a full list in New South Wales of every single member, write to them and just go, are you across this? Are you aware of what the impact is going to be?
Yeah.
Maybe do it. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Phil.
Appreciate your time. Remember to check out smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. You find us on social media. That's how you like to get your info. If you like what we're doing, please subscribe, send us reviews, all that good stuff, which seems to happen. And we'll see you again next time. Until then, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
Feeling trapped by rising interest payments? Escape from mortgage prison with expert refinancing assistance from Finny. We have helped hundreds of borrowers break free from higher loan repayments by finding a more suitable loan. Our expert team can quickly assess your situation, and if there's a better lender available, we'll find it fast. Don't delay. Call today. Speak to a Finny mortgage specialist on 02 8866 2444 or visit our website at www.finny.com.au.